me. Mr. Commissioner, this afternoon we start with a panel on Strategy 4 under the Wild Salmon Policy, Integrated Strategic Planning. We have 4 members of the panel, all of whom have testified before, but just for the record, Paul Ryle is here. He is the lead of the salmon team at DFO. His CV is Exhibit 365 for the record. Also from DFO, we have Mark Saunders, who is the manager of SAFE, I think. Is that correct? His CV is marked as Exhibit 180. Rob Morley is here. He's Vice President of the Canadian Fishing Company and a member of the Fraser River panel. He wins for having had his CV around the longest. His is Exhibit 7. And also back this afternoon we have Jeffrey Young, who we heard from earlier today and yesterday from the David Suzuki Foundation, and his CV was marked as Exhibit 423. I wonder, gentlemen, if I could just very briefly ask you each to describe your...
Mr. Wallace, sorry to interrupt you. For clarification on the record, I believe that Paul Ryle's no longer the lead of the salmon team, that he stepped down approximately 2 years ago, and that Jeff Grout is the present lead of the salmon team. Is that correct?
Well, we're constantly under reorganization in our department. I am back in the lead of the salmon team.
Yes. You can't win.
And I'm still Commissioner, Mr. Tim.
But the reason that Tim didn't know that is because I didn't tell him. And that is really relatively recently.
That interjection did remind me, though, that I should say also for the record that all of these gentlemen have been reminded that their affirmations from their previous appearances are still in effect. Perhaps starting with you, Mr. Ryle, I'm seeking a very brief description of your experience with the Strategy 4 of the Wild Salmon Policy.
My experience with the Wild Salmon Policy, I guess, started back in 2004, 2005, when the policy was, in 2004, was still being developed. I had some role in its development. I wasn't playing a day-to-day activity in its development, but I was working in fish management at that time, and was lead of the salmon team, and was inputting, and we also had a member from fish management that was on the team, Sandy Fraser, and so there was a lot of conversations between Sandy and I and others on the team about what we were looking for in the Wild Salmon Policy. Since that time, I've been involved in implementation of the Wild Salmon Policy as far as Strategy 4 goes in a variety of ways. One was a program known as FRISI, Fraser River Sockeye Spawning Initiative. Also was involved in the Barkley Sound pilot as well. So my involvement is spanned from, I guess, 2004 up to about 2009.
Thank you, Mr. Ryle. Same question for you, Mr. Saunders.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, my involvement in the Wild Salmon Policy, and in particular Strategy 4, goes back to 2003 when I started with an assignment with the policy branch within Department of Fisheries and Oceans to work as a coordinator on the development of the Wild Salmon Policy. So it was I was part of the team that was building the policy, and I think the Strategy 4, the integrated planning piece, was one area that I had a very active hand in. Sandy Fraser was a large part of that, as was Jay Hartling, who's no longer with the department, who had considerable experience and was heading up the consultation secretariat. So the principles and a lot of the approaches that were put forward around Strategy 4 were a lot of her thinking and others that had gone before, but I was one area where I had an active role. And as I moved forward on the implementation, despite being away for several years, it's still an area that I remain very active in and committed to as I see a critical part of the implementation, and I have a specific interest in the science management interface and the role, how science's role needs to evolve as we go into these collaborative processes. So I think I have a pretty active involvement in Strategy 4.
Thank you. Mr. Morley?
Mr. Commissioner, I think perhaps the Commission Council's reference to the length of my CV being around has some crack about the fact that I'm the oldest member of the panel. But my involvement of in the Wild Salmon Policy Strategy 4, other than being one of the stakeholders commenting on the development of the policy like many others, my direct involvement has really been through participating in what the department has referred to as the sort of pilot implementation of Strategy 4 in two areas, one being as a member of the Skeena Watershed Initiative since that's inception, and the other one being as part of the Frizzy process, and my experience in dealing with Strategy 4 in both those areas.
Thank you. Mr. Young?
I'd say I've been involved with work related to the policy since 2005, including just prior to its release. Early on, we identified our view was that the importance of Strategy 4 was quite high, and that we emphasized that as a key element of getting the implementation completed. As a result, we produced a couple of reports that tried to look at practical means and ways of implementing Strategy 4. I've also been fairly involved with a range of different consultations, stakeholder discussions, and meetings with DFO around the policy and Strategy 4.
Thank you. I wonder, Mr. Lon, if I could have Exhibit 8 on the screen, please, and particularly page 24. A little grounding context for the questions that will follow. This is, I just want to record the Strategy 4 in the Wild Salmon Policy, and in particular that it is stated in the first sentence that it is to follow the life cycle of the salmon throughout. And partway down the page, it, I think, has a pretty succinct summary of how it works. And I'll just read that. Strategies 1, 2, and 3 will provide information on the status. This is in the middle of the paragraph on the screen. The status of the CUs, their habitat, and the ecosystem as inputs to the planning process. However, strategic plans need to integrate that information and specify long-term biological targets for CUs and groups of CUs that ensure conservation and sustainable use, identify recommended resource management actions to protect or restore Pacific salmon, their habitats, and ecosystems in order to achieve these targets, and establish timeframes and priorities for action. And that I take to be the nub of what Strategy 4 is intended to do. It's divided into two steps, the first being action step 4.1, described on page 25, being for the establishment of an interim process, and 4.2, the development of a new integrated planning structure for the long term. And that's in that context, I just wanted to set that out. If I may go to the paragraph, to the heading action step 4.1 on page 25. Action step 4.1, the implementation of an interim process for management of priority CUs. The identification of priority CUs is an issue which has come up, and I'd like to just refer and have a couple of questions relating to the identification of priority CUs. That And for that purpose, I would take you, please, Mr. Commissioner and witnesses, to the middle of page 26. The paragraph starting interim procedures will build on. So this is what how the narrative that relates to strategy 4.1 as I read it. Interim procedures will build on and expand the approach now used to develop IFMPs for salmon. The biological status of a CU or group of CUs vulnerable to fisheries in an area will be reviewed. CUs in the red zone and those that could significantly limit fishing and other activities will be identified as management priorities. The protection and restoration of these CUs will be primary drivers for harvest habitat and enhancement planning. So my question is whether there has yet been any priority CU identified. Mr. Saunders?
Mr. Commissioner, I think the notion of priority conservation units, if two ways to approach this. To ask us if they have been identified specifically in the context of the WSP, as it states, will identify priority CUs. I would say that work has been done to, on several occasions, to bring forward to our operations committee and senior managers an approach to identifying priority conservation units, and I would say that specific activity, as indicated in the policy, has not been done or taken through to final completion. What has been done, though, is the department does recognize in the development of its integrated fisheries management plans and longer-term plans, research and otherwise, takes into account stocks of concern that are identified through another vehicle called the Outlook. And so, stocks of concern receive specific attention and detailed actions to deal with those conservation issues articulated in the IFMP. So, do we prioritize work and actions related to CUs? Yes, we do. Have we specifically identified priority CUs as identified in the policy? No, we have not.
I take it it's your intention to do so?
Yes, absolutely.
And I wonder if you could advise Mr. Saunders what criteria, in your view, should be used to identify or determine priority CUs?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, I'd also ask my colleague, Mr. Ryle, he may wish to comment on this as well, but there are, and I certainly don't have the exhaustive list of some of the items that we've considered on priority, but certainly conservation status would be one of the indicators that we would be looking at driving priority, but there would also be a wide range of social and economic considerations, importance to commercial, recreational, and First Nations fisheries, a more general importance to First Nations cultural needs, and there are a number, I think there are probably a number of other factors that escape me right now, but a lot of different factors that would roll into determining a priority conservation unit.
Mr. Rao?
Yeah, well, I would add as well, when we were looking at some possibilities for identifying priority CUs, some of the consideration criteria were also international impacts was one of the other ones that I recall, as well also the scale and the scope of the particular CU, meaning by that how large it might be, what importance it might be to First Nations, what importance might be to commercial and recreational, were some of the other criteria that we're looking at as far as identifying priority CUs. So, you know, you can categorize the priorities into the biological, which would be the status, whether they're in the red zone, for example, and also looking at some of these other impacts. So those were some of the criteria that we were looking at.
Mr. Young, do you agree with those criteria?
Partly, I think I interpret the policy, and particularly the section I have here, to suggest that any CU identified to be in the red zone must be a priority CU. I think there's the potential for there to be additional CUs to be considered based on some of those other factors, but that ultimately CUs in the red zone, as a result of being in the red zone, automatically are priority CUs.
Thank you. Mr. Morley?
I don't have anything to add.
Thank you. Mr. Saunders, I wonder if we could go back to 2006, and if I could take you to tab 1, Mr. Lunn, of the Commission's authorities. This is an email from you, and when scrolling through it, you appear to be here identifying a number of priority CUs in 2006. Or I wonder if you could just describe for us that exercise and what happened to it. So back in 2006, it looked as though you were beginning to describe priority CUs, and yet today you can't say that they have been identified.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner. I don't recognize or I remember going through several exercises on priority development of priority conservation units. I don't recall this particular exchange, but all I can say is that we brought forward a number of proposals on how we might identify priority conservation units, and were never able to land on a satisfactory methodology that got senior management approval.
Okay, and this was reflected in an early attempt that you're trying to get the process going in 2006?
I believe that's the case,
Yeah.
yes.
Mr. Commissioner, may this document, Mr. Saunders' email of June 26th, 2006, be marked as the next exhibit, please. Now, you say these were brought forward but not approved by management. So the question of priority CUs was considered by the Operations Committee in 2007. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
And if I may take you to tab 2 of the Commission's book of documents, I think maybe if you could just tell us how the consideration of this issue developed.
Can you give me a little more on what you mean by how it was developed?
Well, in tab 2 is an email with an attachment, and the email attaches the commission, the Ops Committee DM, the spreadsheet used to develop the table of priority CUs. Does that, it says there that it went to the Ops Committee but was not referred to the Regional Management Committee. Is that what happened there?
Yeah, I'm just trying to refresh myself with this, but it looks like we were working on a decision note that we did not receive approval, that we were looking at. We had some direction to build, to elaborate further on the planning template and test it on one CU. So I think we received general support for the type of work we were doing, but weren't prepared to see a blanket implementation of it, wanted more testing to go forward on it.
For that Ops Committee meeting consideration, you prepared the briefing note that's attached to that?
I don't recall if I was the author on this or not.
So maybe I could help out as well.
Thank you, Mr. Rao.
So this is going back to 2004, is it? Or 6?
2006.
So My recollection is, as we were working on this document, a number of us, and I'm referring here to the briefing note,
Yes.
along with the table that's attached to it, that shows what these criteria are that we consider to identify priority CUs. And it was presented at Ops Committee. And as Mark has indicated, it was not agreed that this was quite the right mix of criteria and further work needed to be done to undertake to identify priority CUs. And coming out of that Ops Committee meeting was the direction that we should embark upon a pilot in Barkley Sound to gather more information, to better understand, and to learn about how we would create additional criteria for generating priority CUs.
And do you recall the genesis of this briefing note, which has your name on the bottom of it?
Of the briefing note?
Yes.
Yeah, I was involved in drafting this, but I said there was a number of us as well.
Right, and that was when it was decided to go with a pilot project instead.
Yeah, that's correct. There was concern about, okay, if this is not quite the right criteria, and also what sort of scale do we want to undertake on generating these kind of strategic plans, and let's try it, test drive it on a particular area, and Barkley Sound was chosen.
Mr. Commissioner, may this briefing note then be marked as the next exhibit, please?
Mr. Wallace, there's 3 documents there. Is that, do you want them all in one, or can you specify the one can number?
It's simply the briefing note.
Just a briefing note. That's great.
The briefing note includes the briefing note and the spreadsheet, which I think is part of it. Not the
Okay, Exhibit 941 will have reference to can number can 189142 and 143.
In the year or two following the adoption of the Wild Salmon Policy, this is for you, Mr. Saunders or Mr. Ryle, did the policy branch ever create a discussion paper on integrated strategic planning for salmon conservation?
I don't know if you're referring to a particular document, but there was a couple of documents that were created on an integrated strategic planning that Sandy Fraser was the author of, and I don't know if you're referring to those or others.
When were they prepared?
One was created in 2007, and then there was another in 2009.
I'm going to come back to that. Earlier this afternoon, we were at page 26 of the Wild Salmon Policy, and we were talking about the reference in the middle of that page to what it is to determine priority CUs, and it seems pretty clear that status of the CU, those in the red zone, are the key to that. At page 2 of the exhibit, the issue of status does not seem to be mentioned at all, Mr. Ryle. Can you explain why?
In which document?
At page 2, you propose 3 equally weighted criteria for determining priority CUs: habitat status, profile, and planning capacity, as opposed to page 26 of the Wild Salmon Policy, which talks about the biological status of a site, CU or group of CUs, as being the key criterion. My question is that consistent with the Wild? Is your memo, in your view, consistent with the Wild Salmon Policy?
just taken a look at the actual table that's attached in this as well.
We're just having a look at the table here, but I believe that outlook status was a large part of the prior. It says, under analysis, it says the stock of, under the second line, it says, under analysis, identification of priority CUs, it says the stock of concern designated in the DFO 2007 Outlook was used as a proxy to delimit the red zone and identify priority CUs. So I think the list that you've got there in the table, those are all lists, all CUs that have been identified red, as Jeffrey's pointed out. If you've got a red designation, then we listed a prioritized, then the remainder of the table addresses the other items that you might use to prioritize work on that.
So you now, can you just point out where in the exhibit you're?
Sorry, I'm in the decision note that describes the analysis.
In page 1.
Page 1 of that. I'm also talking, yes, so if you're under analysis, identification of priority CUs, and then the second bullet, stock of concern designation, yes, provided in the DFO 2000, etc. That line is indicating that we're using that as a proxy because at this point we hadn't really fully identified the CUs and the work on the benchmarks is underway.
So maybe just to expand upon that, this was a two-tier approach. Right. First, identify them, which ones are in the red zone, and then once they're identified in the red zone, they're in this table, table 1, that's in the decision note, and these other considerations that are listed. And the equal weighting was applied to those is what the note is talking about. And I do recall as we were going through this, we talked about different sorts of weighting to the second tier of evaluation. But
so the last bullet there, you can go back, it says, the second to last bullet, appendix table 1 attached lists the 20 stocks of concern / priority CUs. So we had used that criteria above from the Outlook to determine that these were the priority CUs, and then we've got some ranking within those priority CUs.
Thank you.
In the table.
Now, you referred to this as a decision note, but in fact, I understood this was a briefing note. We have not seen a decision note from the Ops Committee from this, although we have requested all of those. Are you aware whether there is a decision note, in fact, from this meeting?
Are we? I'm not aware that beyond this note there was anything else generated as far as the decision note. And as we indicated earlier, this approach was not approved.
Since the Wild Salmon Policy has been adopted in 2005, has DFO policy staff or other DFO staff ever developed any socioeconomic framework to be used in integrated strategic planning under WSP? Mr. Rao?
I have seen a national policy that was drafted, I think it was from 2008, that listed 3 tiers of social and economic analysis. One would be a very low-level type of analysis, basically an evaluation of economic status within a fishery, and that's what's being incorporated currently within the IFMP in various stages across the region. Another level would be more comprehensive and undertake an economic analysis, and the most comprehensive social and economic impact would look at various options. And the intent of that policy was, and that final stage could be used for more comprehensive problems, and it could be for dealing with things that stocks of concern or potentially Sarah listed, I think was one of the intents. But that was the last I saw was a 2008 draft policy.
And that was a draft?
Yes.
But there's been no policy adopted, to your knowledge, for this framework.
Not to my knowledge.
I understand that DFO has an internal working group developing a draft governance framework for Strategy 4 back in 2008. Am I correct on that? And
I was not involved in that.
Exhibit 192, Mr. Lund? This was referred to in 2008. I guess the question really is what has happened to that framework? Was it ever finalized and put in effect?
Mr. Commissioner, I didn't return to the department. I've been away until late January, February, really starting my position back in DFO of 2009. So I'm not. I'm not sure what you're referring to as the framework.
Page 20 of 41 in that deck.
Slide 20.
Yes. Page 20. Slide 7 and 8. It says slide. The center box in the strategy for integrated strategic planning, internal working group developing draft governance framework. And do either of you know whether or not anything ever transpired out of that work?
I'm not aware of anything in that regard.
Mr. Ryle?
No, I'm not.
Have any response teams been brought together under Strategy 4 as contemplated in the Action Step 4.1?
Well, that's been one of our ongoing challenges, I would say, within the implementation of the Wild Salmon Policy. In some various forms, the answer to me would be yes. And so going back to the Fraser River Sockeye Spawning Initiative, the intent of that was to develop a team. So that was undertaken. And also with the Barkley Sound pilot, there has been a team that has been put together, and started back in 2008, I think it was, and more recently there's more work underway within the Barkley Sound pilot as well.
Mr. Young, are you aware of whether or not there have been any response teams, and what would be your response to the reference to Frizzy?
My interpretation of a response team from Strategy 4 and the policy is to deal specifically with CUs of concern, if I understood correctly, and therefore I don't really see Frizzy or the Barkley Sound pilot groups that were formed, or the Skeena Watershed Initiative groups, being kind of consistent with the definition of a response team. I think the closest thing to that would be some of the elements that came together around cultists, although that wasn't really a Wild Salmon Policy based initiative, and it also doesn't really fully meet the definition of response team.
Yeah. Mr. Morley, did you have any involvement with response teams in the Skeena initiative?
I would totally agree with Jeffrey's characterization of the response teams, and I wouldn't call the Skeena Watershed process or Frizzy a quote response team. I think cultists could be looked at that way, but again, nothing formal with respect to the strategy for the Wild Salmon Policy, for sure.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
So, I mean, there's different formulations of a response team. There's 420 conservation units within salmon within BC, roughly, give or take. And I would argue that a number of those would be identified as priority CUs, and we talked earlier about a list of them that was not approved, but if we went back and took a look within the IFMP, there's a chapter that identifies stocks of concern. Some of those are groups of CUs, and some of them are CUs by their own right. So I think one of our challenges with implementing a strategy 4 is on what sort of scale are you going to develop these response teams? And I have a hard time envisioning that we're going to develop a response teams for each individual CUs, given what resources are available, both internally and externally. But to me, that's only one aspect of consideration resources. The other important one is these stocks do not migrate individually. They migrate at the same time across the same geography for a good part of them. And so to me, when you're going to develop a response team, you're going to need to consider a number of factors to take into account of how you're going to develop these response teams. And one of the papers that's in our binders is what sort of scale would you develop integrated strategic plans around? And that scale, well, I would say that it's not finalized, was presented at Ops Committee back in 2009 and was I would say tentatively approved. It was an outright endorsement, but it took that scale of conservation units from 420 down to a range of 20 to 25. And the thinking was, rather than formally saying that's the right number, the thinking was that you're on the right track by taking into account biological impacts, which is the status, but also is where do these fish migrate and who's impacted as well, meaning people. And when I say people, I mean First Nations that are harvesting these recreational and commercial, but and also the ecosystem. And so it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think one of the critical pieces here is really around what sort of scale are we going to develop response teams around. So I think, was the Frizzy process a response team on one particular CU? No, it wasn't. It was, to me, it was dealing with a particular aspect around harvest management, which is only one part of the strategic plan. And it did deal with Fraser sockeye, which are 36 conservation units. And I would argue that's a much better way to develop response teams than to develop individual response teams for each CU. Because each one of these things are not isolated. They impact across the board, whether biologically or impacts upon people. And part of the WSP is social and economic impacts as well, which is highlighted. And so that's why my answer was the Frizzy was a response team. Was it perfect? Probably not. I think personally that it was a pretty good start. My other part of the answer around Barkley Sound sockeye was going back to why our priority tables were not endorsed, was that we needed to learn some more, and let's do it in a pilot. And I know when we first started on the Barkley one, my actual thinking was that the Barkley might not even be the right scale either and probably should be larger, because there's CUs that cut across the borders of the Barkley Sound. And I think if I had to rethink that going back now, I probably would make it broader than Barkley Sound and probably make it the West Coast. But at least within that one, it was all salmon species, and because there's not just one thing happening here, and what was interesting to me within Barkley is that it's not just wild salmon, there's a significant hatchery within Barkley Sound on Chinook, and that was another piece of information that we needed to factor into our thinking around implementation of strategic plans.
Jiang, do you have a response to that?
I agree generally with the point that we should find efficiencies where possible, so I think that's ideal and necessary. I think, though, that those types of efforts should in no way diminish what the point of identifying a priority CU is, and the critical issue that's being coming out of identifying a CU in the red zone. For example, I think to be able to properly characterize anything as a response team, it would at least have to put first and foremost its priority being the recovery of a CU of concern or a CU below the red zone. I don't think Frizzy was about that, and it definitely did not involve the full range of people that would be affected in particular by a CU in the red zone. So I think there's a number of issues there, but not to lose the point that efficiency is important, but I think it's really critical to emphasize that the whole point of priority CUs in the red zone ranking shouldn't be lost in terms of identifying an appropriate, efficient response.
Okay. Mr. Morley or Mr. Saunders, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, I think I agree in part with both Jeff and Paul, and I don't think there's a single right answer around this question of whether or not frizzy and processes like it constitute a response process. I think it's it's absolutely key point is that there are. If we look at some of the processes, answering this question of scale is really critical, and I think that's what the senior management was questioning when they asked us to go back with this notion of priority CUs and what a planning template looked like, and asked us to conduct work to help them understand exactly what the size of this piece, what it would entail. So I think a lot of this work went into what we call pilots. So went into SOMAS, and as Paul says, then when you start to work on the ground, you come to these issues of where are the boundaries of the CUs, where are the geopolitical boundaries that the human influences on these various conservation units, where do they reside, and how do you get people around the table. And I think that to get to the outcome that you ultimately want to get to, that if you don't arrive at the right scale, I think it limits the options that you might have. For instance, if you're looking at the Fraser, if you focus on cultus in general, there's a context of a fishery that's right across the Canadian and into U.S. waters. There are fisheries issues that are impacted as much as there are local issues. So if the process, and as well, there are impacts on other species and other fisheries. So if you were trying to arrive at options and approaches to move forward around cultus, a more effective planning table or a recovery response team might include looking at all of the species. If I was looking at social and economic objectives related to the commercial and recreational and First Nations, I would be wanting to think about the Fraser in its the entire breadbasket, or that's at play in terms of the economic engine, and looking at options that would go beyond just the impact of perceived actions that we could take for cultists. So I think this question is a complicated one, but a real key piece of trying to design and get so that we don't lose our accountability, as Jeffrey's pointing to, for each of the conservation units, but looking for solutions that we've got an appropriate scale to give you the right context to find solutions that are optimal. And I think one of my key interests in this, in understanding the subtleties that may not be well articulated in the Wild Salmon Policy, is that this is about sustainable development. This is looking for options that meet social, economic, and conservation objectives concurrently.
Mr. Ryle, Mr. Saunders, has DFO ever created a template for a strategic plan for strategy for?
Within some of the work that I had contracted Sandy Fraser to undertake, he did put together a template that's included in the 2009 report that Sandy did.
And these reports, and for the record, these are found at tabs 4, 5, and 6 of the Commission's binder. If I could look at which one, the March of 2009 or October? Identifying planning units and prioritizing integrated strategic planning initiatives under the Wild Salmon Policy.
Mr. Wallace, when you don't speak into the mic, we can't hear what you're saying.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Tab 6?
It's the one I'm referring to is under tab 4.
That's the December 2007
That's correct.
discussion paper?
And in particular in that, starting on page 18, documenting the plan, section 6, it outlines a template that could be used.
This was advice to DFO from a consultant, correct?
Well, it was a contract undertaken by direction of myself that had contracted Sandy Fraser.
And has it found its way into a plan adopted by DFO for strategic planning?
At this point, no. The Barclay Sound document that's also included in here was another template that could be used as well. I think, to me, what the work that Mr. Fraser undertook in 2007 of documenting the plan was a good start of a template. Other work that's underway within the department right now actually is another policy document around a rebuilding plan. That is another piece of policy work that's being undertaken nationally that's not yet complete, but I expect within 2011 it will be complete. So I think there's a couple of templates that are available that one could use for developing an integrated strategic plan. But if I had to boil it down to the simplest thing is that what we're looking for is a plan that's going to set long-term direction, and it's going to have certain sections in it that'll set long-term direction on harvest management, habitat, and enhancement. And it'll lay out those objectives and goals that one will want to undertake in each one of those pieces. And I would expect that there would be a status report included in that template.
Yeah.
But
sorry, Mr. Elman, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
Sure.
we have very limited time. I wanted to identify the fact that this reflects advice received by DFO, but it has not yet found its way into any plan that's been accepted or a template that's been adopted for strategy 4 by DFO. Is that correct?
I would agree that this has not worked its way into a...
And the other documents the other templates that are available likewise have not been adopted by DFO.
Yes, I would agree with that. The other one is a work in progress.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if the 2007 paper of Mr. Fraser could be marked as an exhibit, please.
Mr. Wallace, I'm wondering if Mr. Weil could be permitted to answer the question that he started to answer.
Did you have an opportunity to complete your answer, Mr. Weil?
Well, the only other point I would add, and thanks very much, is that we've worked on a variety of templates. I would say that some of the pieces have worked in various formats. And what I was thinking as far as moving forward really was where I was going is what are we looking for into an integrated strategic plan? And to me, it's setting the long-term goals and objectives that are going to work themselves into the integrated fishery management plans, which are currently on an annual basis, but as I think I might have testified earlier, is that we're looking at making those multi-year to make them broader in scope as well.
I don't think we managed to get the 2007 document from Mr. Fraser marked.
We did not. It's 942.
Thank you.
Mr. Wallace, I don't mean to interrupt. I know you are on a tight timetable, and I know the Commission Council have allocated to themselves the amount of time. Is that time now expired, or is it still running?
Yes. But my hope is that if I may have a few minutes more, Mr. Commissioner, I may have cut down on work that Mr. Timberg will undoubtedly wish to do.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear your last comment, but I just wanted you to be mindful of your friends' time allocations.
I'm cognizant of those.
Right, thank you.
I have one question following up on this, Mr. Commissioner, for Mr. Morley. Have you seen any template for strategic planning from DFO under Strategy 4?
Mr. Commissioner, actually, to me, the best template for strategic planning is attached in the Wild Salmon Policy under Appendix 2, a structured 5-step planning procedure, and I think it actually is fairly straightforward. It's succinct, and that is really where I think they should be going in this area, and so that to me is the best template I've seen. And
thank you. Would this be a convenient time to take the break, Mr. Commissioner? I'm in your hands, Mr. Commissioner. I do have more that I wish to cover. I have been unsuccessful in getting this done as efficiently as I would have liked. But with the break, I think that would give us an opportunity to make this as efficient as possible and not leave out something fundamental.
If it will help Mr. Wallace, I'm prepared to do that. We'll
Thank
take a
you.
10-minute break then.
Thank you.
Hearing no recess for 10 minutes.
Fine.